Perfect. So we're talking about a kind of a little broader topic today, and it's restricted materials legislations and where they come from. So where this really came from is now, well, a little different situation in the world right now, and a lot of people also working from home or remotely. We're doing a lot more webinars than we normally do. Seemed like the right thing to do, and as part of each webinar now, when you get that mailer at the end, which isn't just sales fluff, we're actually looking for recommendations on what would people like to see in webinar. And feel free to send your recommendations. We're probably going to do more than normal right now. It seems like a good thing to do, quite useful thing. And people have to spend their time doing something and might as well learn about some topics. So this came from actually a couple people made a request. They're trying to figure out whether or not there's commonality between all these legislations and can they focus on a subset to really handle all of them. One of the things we've always talked about in restricted materials is if you ask for one thing, you'll probably get one thing. You'll probably get that one thing. So you ask your supplier for one thing, you'll probably get it. You ask your supplier for two things, you might get the two things. You ask them for three, you might get two. You ask them for 10, you probably get zero. Or confusion, or they'll just sign it. You send them asking them compliance on 12 different things, and they'll send you back the signed letter within 30 seconds. That's also a wee bit concerning unless they really know their stuff. So, and you can't do everything. And there's all of these different legislations have impact on your product, but what can you focus on to have a better idea of everything else? So to do that, what we want to talk about is more, where do all these darn things come from? We have these legislations, and some of them have the same name in them, like RoHS or REACH, which doesn't always mean they mean the same thing. But a lot of them are very strange names: Canadian Prohibition, EU Persistent Organic Pollutant, California Proposition 65. But is there any commonality? And you can see some of the same substances popping up: DHP, lead, of course, a variety of other things. But we want to talk about where they really come from to give you a better idea of their progress and sources. And if you understand the sources a lot better, what's going to be regulated and how, to a certain extent, is more understandable. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about the common sources of legislation. We're going to talk about waste, classification, risk management, and UN Convention. So it's a bit of an oversimplification, and I'm going to explain those in detail. So I'm not really going to talk about them too much right now. And we'll talk about some commonality, options, differences, effective approaches. These all still have politics involved, and those politics and the nitpicky fine details will cause differences in the legislation. Partially because of legislative structure, partially because humans like to fiddle. Partially sometimes other countries in the best intentions are, what we're reading is a translation from their language of their translation of the English version from Europe. And so there are inconsistencies, especially when you're dealing with semantics. And as you get towards SCIP, you're going to see, not that SCIP is anywhere else right now, you're going to see that semantics is a big deal. And REACH SVHCs in particular, where semantics is a big deal. So the idea here is about be 50 minutes long. It actually might be a touch short, which maybe I can actually slow down and enunciate. But we all have hope. And then there's a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. This is I won't say esoteric. This is, in some ways, part of it's going to be a history lesson. And some are going to be like, well, not quite. Some of this is simplification. I'll try to explain the simplification versus the complex situation to an extent. But this is just an easier way to understand it. So, of course, want to go to real depth. Our absolutely probably most popular service, and I think we've had almost everybody who's ever signed up is still with us for it, is basically every quarter or month, depending on the situation, your situation, we get together and have a meeting. But it's like this, except for it's interactive. You'll be talking, you can ask questions, and you can invite many stakeholders you want. And we talk about the changes in restricted materials legislation, how they impact your products. We talk about your medical device, we talk about your speaker, we talk about your server, we talk about your assembly line, or whichever what you make and how it really affects you, or in some cases does not. There's a number of legislations that look like they affect you. Sometimes because they have the word RoHS in them, but don't, or don't yet. And try to explain the differences. And then also the subtle differences where it's the exact same test standards, but you have to submit a test report to the government or to a notified body, etc. Or you have to enter the information on the government website, and explaining those differences. And also allows you to ask questions like, oh, do you mean this? Or how about this type of product? So it's very interactive. It's just for your company. You invite as many stakeholders as you want. It's very, very popular. And if you don't like it, you can stop. But it's very useful. Not only do we get an update, and a lot of people have different services or searches that provide them a decent update, but a lot of those updates are also what people want to sell you. And we also have to be cognizant of that. A lot of what we're doing is talking about the changes. So we hear the new, this month, the new 5 proposed substances become REACH SVHCs. This is what they're really used in, and this is whether they're even likely to be in your product and why, and explain that. So a lot more detail, and you also ask questions about, well, we actually have this type of curing ink. Yes, and this is why it wouldn't be declarable, and explain the reasoning. So very popular. If you like what we're doing here, this is even better. It's very much tailored to what, it's very timely in terms of what's changing right now. This is probably the most fluid set of legislations compared to electrical safety or EMC, and very, very useful. So definitely strong recommendations. So back to the main topic, as I got sidetracked. But so where do all these legislations come from? And there's lots of them, and there's more springing up every day. So we have EU RoHS, which is in a lot of ways the parent or the first of these. When a lot of us got involved originally in this is because of RoHS. When I got involved in this in 2004, it was because of RoHS. And a lot of people have been in the industry for a long time. RoHS really propelled the product level compliance forward. Prop 65 has been there for a long time, but its enforcement in physical products really didn't appear to much more recently, mostly around 2014. So we're going to talk about all of these. You have all these legislations. You have the Canadian Prohibition. You have the REACH SVHC versus the REACH Restriction, which are quite different. Article 33 versus Article 67. They're actually different sources. We'll talk about that history. Persistent organic pollutant in the EU, Prop 65, China RoHS, China REACH, Canadian Prohibition, EU MDR, etc. But is there any commonality? That's when people are like, oh, look at all these fancy, funky names. Here are some of the same substances like DHP, lead, etc. But is there any commonality? Or more importantly, predictability? Is there a way I can handle this? Which ones do I have to pay attention to as they cover the others? It's one of the common questions. Like, okay, this is a lot. Which are the key ones? Like, which ones do I have to really worry about? And it's interesting. Some are the main legislations around certain substances, but the restrictions are often more obscure. The Canadian Prohibition is your real stop ship risk in North America, not Prop 65. Prop 65 is a lawsuit fine issue. Canadian Prohibition is not as well known, but it is a very high risk of stop ship. So it's what people pay attention to. It's also interesting. So there are 4 major families. I'm going to go through them, and this is a simplification. There is overlap. We're going to talk about waste legislation, classification and labeling legislation, risk management, and UN convention. So there is overlap, and definitely classification, which we'll go into a lot, has a lot of effect on all of them. Classification and labeling. And to the point where one of the EU regulations is called the Classification, Labeling, and Packaging legislation, which is very much originally part of REACH. So REACH the REACH regulation had the CLP elements in it, and then eventually they created CLP separately, Classification, Labeling, and Packaging, and pulled that section out of REACH and created its own regulation. And classification is one of the more dominant aspects of all of it, classifying the hazard or risk. But the one that really started was waste. And so we're going to start, I'm not going to talk about each one right now. I'm going to go through each one independently. And the waste one is really the one that started it. So even though classification and labeling is probably the most fundamental part of it, it really all started with the waste side. What do I mean by the waste? So the waste legislations, for the most part, are around restriction. You cannot have these substances in the product because they can affect or poison the recycling worker or the environment. So we'll talk about that. RoHS and WEEE, and really it's WEEE started, are part of this. Now people talk about the Waste Framework Directive. It's a waste one, but it's really a classification and labeling. The element it. So you can't be also And one thing to be confusing is the name of the directive or regulation legislation isn't necessarily where it's categorized here. So the Waste Framework Directive, as it applies to materials restriction, it does have materials restrictions for what can go into waste or landfill. But the element that affects general products, the SCIP database, is really classification and labeling. And I'll get back to that. So even though it's called the Waste Framework Directive, it's really a classification and labeling section. So waste legislation is primarily where it restricts or governs restricted substances in products. It's around prevention of the exposure to the waste worker or to the environment. And so this is one of the most often unknown things about RoHS. RoHS A was never meant to exist, and B is not around user safety. It's actually accidental. Strange enough, it's an accidental directive. So way back, it's like, how do you accidentally create legislation? It's a good question. So many years ago, closer to 2000, if not earlier, the EU governments were looking at all this electronic waste coming back, and they didn't want to landfill it, but more importantly, they didn't want to pay for it. So we're looking at fridges and stoves and TVs and cell phones back then are quite a bit bigger, and especially TVs. TVs are a huge problem. They're much bigger than they are now, and they also had mercury. Their CRT tubes had mercury and were much bigger. As much as we talk about how big our TVs are, they're really quite thin. And if you ever take one apart, which we do all the time, they're mostly little LEDs, tiny little LEDs, with these little cones around them to shine light on the LCD screen or whichever in front of it, which blocks certain colors. It's basically a very thin lamp. So the old TVs were big, and they're looking at the stoves and fridges and all this waste coming back. They didn't just want to put in a landfill, but more important, they didn't want to pay for it. So they created the concept of the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, WEEE, with the concept of recycling, but more important to them is to offload the responsibility, i.e. cost, of the end of life of electronics from the governments and users to the importers and manufacturers, which to a certain extent makes sense because they're the ones who can more capable of controlling the cost it takes to recycle products. So when that occurred, they did some trial projects, I believe in Sweden, and they found out they were horribly poisoning the recycling workers and the environment and the air and the water around them with lead, mercury, cadmium, hexavalent chromium, so chromate. So hexavalent chromium really is never CR6+. It's really a chromate. It's chromium oxide. And 2 families of brominated flame retardants. And the recycling workers were having 10,000 to 100,000 times the levels of these chemicals in their bloodstream compared to the average population. So they had a problem. They really want to implement this legislation to save them a lot of money. And also, in Europe in particular, a lot of the countries don't have space for landfill. They don't have extra land. So they're looking at recycling. They couldn't implement this and create this hazard for the recycling worker and all the environment around the recycling plant, lead and mercury and all that kind of stuff. Mercury being actually a more significant problem back then because of all the CRT TVs. So they put materials restrictions into WEEE. They didn't create the RoHS directive actually at that point in time. They put material restrictions into WEEE, like there is in the pre-existing packaging directive. The packaging directive also has materials restrictions, also around waste and recycling. What they found when they tried to implement the legislation, it didn't work. A WEEE is an environmental directive. It's a minimum directive, and that means the individual countries have leeway on implementation because anything related to the waste system has to take into account the fact that each country has a different waste framework. Municipal, provincial, territorial, federal, however it all works out. And it's quite different. So in the environmental directives, they provide goals for the countries of which the countries have to figure out how to meet. So in WEEE, there are goals for recycling percentage. People often believe, my product has to be X percent recyclable. No, the requirement in WEEE is not for the product to be that percent recyclable. It's a requirement for the country to recycle up to that percentage. It's quite different. So it's a goal, which when you put in product level restrictions didn't work. So at the last minute, they pulled it out. They made it into an Article 95 directive at that time, which is a product directive, like the CE marking. But they did it so quickly, they basically had 2 meetings and implemented it. They weren't able to bring it into CE. They also weren't sure, but doing it so quickly, whether it's a good idea for monitoring control and medical devices. So they put a notwithstanding clause in it saying, hey, we're implementing this. It's not part of CE. It follows the same legislative structure. It's Article 95 back then. It's a product level one governed by basically the director of business. But notwithstanding, we're going to rewrite it or recast it in the future to A, bring it into CE marking, B, reevaluate whether medical devices or monitoring and control should be in scope, which they'd added, and then C, are there any other substances that are dangerous to recycling workers? So this is where RoHS came from. RoHS was basically, they had 2 meetings and passed it, and they had this notwithstanding clause, so it was rewritten or recast more recently, bring it into CE marking, which would have been the plan to begin with if they started it that way, bringing in medical devices, bringing in monitoring and control, and also bringing in phthalates, which we'll talk about. So these are all around waste legislation, and many other countries have implemented, and they've implemented for 2 reasons. One, as they implement recycling legislation to reduce hazards to their worker, but in a lot of cases to standardize the product standards. So this is a product standard for a lot of them. The product cannot have these things. It's like any other safety standard, EMC standard. So there is a decent amount of standardization. RoHS, unlike the others, has a good level of standardization with, of course, little regional differences on implementation, but very consistent standardization and international standards. REACH doesn't have very many international standards, especially the SVHC side. The waste does. And people say, what about the Waste Framework Directive? It's a waste directive. It is, but the part that affects products is really a classification. I'll explain the difference. It's not a restriction. It's really a communication model for the REACH SVHC. So I'll explain that difference in minutes. Classification is a big deal, but that's the next section. I'm kind of reading ahead here. By the way, if you have questions, which I'm sure you do, feel free to put them in the control panel, and I'll get to as many as I can at the end. On to RoHS. So it originated from WEEE. So WEEE cannot be implemented with increased risk to the recycling worker. It isn't just the recycling worker, it's also the people that transport it, it's the environment around the recycling center. So when they updated the RoHS recast, they said, hey, we can add more substances, and we need to prioritize these 3 phthalates, of which they eventually called 4, because DIBP is very similar. The first part of the consultation is, do they pose a hazard to the recycling worker? So they did measurements and show, yeah, it was appearing in the blood of the recycling worker. It was in the air in the facility. It was in the water around the facility. It was in the earth around the facility, all these elevated phthalate risks. So it was posing a hazard, and they're a known classified risk. This is where classification will kick in. And we'll talk about the next section. They're all category 1B, known to cause, which is 1B in animals. For a variety of reasons, they don't really let us test much on humans anymore. Known to cause in animals reproductive toxicity. So because they posed a hazard to the recycling worker, they were added to RoHS. And they're kicking in a variety of times between 2019 and 2021, depending on your products. And it's because, not because they pose a potential hazard to the user, it's all around the recycler and their environment. So there are more substances going through this consultation process now, MCCPs and tetrabromid bisphenol A. Most of them won't make it through. Where they've been limited on that is the chemicals they're choosing are ones that were REACH registered as chemicals that indicated a use in electronics. So anything that's a significant hazard, or they believed it is going through consultation for being added to RoHS. Unfortunately, it's use at the chemical level as opposed to product level, where most of them, like tetrabromid bisphenol A, are fully reacted and are not really present in the final product. And so all the use information they're using right now is on the chemical use. What they're missing is the article use level. And that's where you'll see some classification stuff like SCIP start to appear. So there are many other substances going through this process. The vast majority will not end up on our RoHS restriction list, mostly because they don't exist in the final product. If you actually want to look, the consultation for all of them is public. We've actually submitted on some of them, particularly medium chain chlorinated parabens, where turns out we're one of the most knowledgeable experts on the use of short chain and medium chain chlorinated paraffins in products and where they're used and why and what they're used with. But it's actually quite a good read. Ours is a decent read, but there's a lot of other good submissions that have much more technical details about where these things are actually used. And this is one thing the EU is missing, or will be missing until SCIP comes along, of where these chemicals are actually used in electronics. Up until now, they're reliant on either guesswork or they're reliant on the uses identified in the REACH registrations. So RoHS came from WEEE, and it was one of the first ones. Now, one of the commonalities many other countries have implemented, and they've implemented mostly restrictions, with a number of countries like China, for example, or Taiwan, phasing in labeling first before restriction. And some countries have registration. Their compliance processes do not necessarily have the trust of self-declared. So there's a registration aspect. So whether or not that's UAE or Eurasian, so the Russian group, or Korea, they don't have necessarily the same trust in self-certification. So there's a registration element. And that's because of the way the compliance system works. However, the substances are the same, or they're the same as the older RoHS. Not all of them have moved added phthalates yet, like China RoHS, et cetera, or Russia. But it is fundamentally the same substances, just which version yet. The test standards are identical with all their flaws. They're now IEC standards. The conformity assessment standards are identical. Now, Europe uses EC 50581, the international version is 63,000. They are not 100% the same, but they're virtually identical. One of the problems with 50581, it was very Eurocentric with its terminology. And so they had to update a lot of terms in the 63,000 to be usable internationally. So it isn't just an EU standard, it's an international standard. But it's fundamentally the same thing. So RoHS does have standardized tests. The substances are standardized, the limits are standardized, and the conformity assessment process is standardized. There are some differences in whether or not the substances are restricted yet, or it's just labeling, and some countries have registration. But otherwise, it's fairly standardized. So if you do EU RoHS, you have the tools to do the others. They may have extra things to do with those tools, like submission of a test report and that kind of thing. One of the biggest ones we've had recently, if you're in scope of EA, Eurasian EU Economic Union, RoHS, they're demanding a test report. Legally, you should be able to manage with a technical file, but a lot of discussions we've been party to, the technical file has been refused. Some have managed to convince, but in general, they demand a test report. So there are different, but the test report is the same test standard as the EU. So there's a slight difference in registration. Many of the countries do not have self-declaration or self-conformity assessment. However, the standards, the test standards, the conformity assessment standards, the substances are all the same, or a previous revision of the current EU. So if you follow in the EU, it'll have likely more than what's going on elsewhere. And it'll give you the tools to do, say, China RoHS or the others. China RoHS is a labeling, but the X's and O's you put in the table are all based on the same European information. So it's one of the ones that has standardization. When you go to the next ones, the standardization doesn't exist in the same manner. This is much more like product standards, where you have safety standards and EMC standards that have a lot of commonality between countries. The idea is to have a lot of IEC or international standards. RoHS has this, the others generally do not. Classification and labeling. This is a lot of the modern legislation. It's actually around classification. So if you have a chemical, a powder or a liquid, and you have a safety data sheet, it'll have the chemicals or substance in it will have classifications. Category 2, skin sensitizer, category 1B, carcinogen, and they'll have labeling around it. So chemicals have a classification and labeling system for both the safety data sheet and the product itself. That classification did not exist, for the most part, in physical products. But a lot of the modern legislations are moving towards a classification labeling, where basically if we had to label the risk in a chemical, why don't we have to label it on a physical product? So usually there's a labeling or warning. It's not a restriction. The classification labeling one may feed the waste or the risk management part we'll talk about. They might feed into it, but they themselves are normally around classifying and labeling or warning for it. So REACH SVHC is the poster child. It is fundamentally an extension of the chemical labeling system to physical products. Prop 65, which is a US version, it's roughly the same thing. It's all around carcinogens and reproductive toxins, and they use a more stringent threshold for reproductive toxicity or cancer, but it's fundamentally a warning or labeling approach. Again, it's not a ban. Prop 65 is not a ban of DHP or lead. It's if the exposure is above a particular level, it requires a warning. So, and Prop 65 is changing it again, but a lot of complexities around internet warnings around smartphones. So there's a whole bunch of consultations about that right now, just to add fun to all this. And then EU MDR. Section 10.4, if you have a category 1 carcinogen, mutagen, or reproductive toxin, again, a classification, material above 0.1% by weight, which is the normal declarable level in a safety data sheet for any of CMR, in a fluid, gas, or invasive path, there is a labeling and justification. So it's very, very similar. It falls on the classification labeling. It's not banned per se. You have to justify it and you have to label for it. But it's more on classification. And it uses, again, classifications, category 1. So I'll explain a lot more of that. So the classification and labeling of substances and articles, it's existed for a long time, originally in a patchwork in chemicals. More recently, with the Global Harmonized System, or GHS, it's moved to more harmonized classification. And the standard ones we see for products are category 1 CMRs. So we used to use the word CMR. It's carcinogen, mutagen, reproductive toxin, which I've written in different order here. Carcinogen, reproductive toxin, or mutagen, but CMR is the common one. It has to be category 1 normally. Category 1, A and B are known to cause. Category 2 is potential. In theory, you could regulate on CMR2, but it rarely happens. They're basically, the ones that get regulated are all category 1s. Or, especially in Europe, endocrine disruptor, which until maybe this round of ReACH SVHCs are every single endocrine disruptor for human health is also category 1B reproductive toxin. So endocrine disruptor, they're not necessarily reproductive toxin, but I'd say they normally are. They disrupt the endocrine system through one of two modes. Either they or their metabolite is similar to estrogen and creates an estrogenic or female body response with all its negative effects, or it's a thyroid disruptor and prevents the formation of the T4 hormone and causes hypothyroid, which leads to a lot of negative actions, including bladder cancer. So it's one of two families. Respiratory sensitizer. This is a chemical that causes sensitization of the respiratory system. Strangely enough, dermal sensitizers are not normally regulated yet as dermal sensitizers in products because they could not show long-term harm. Well, respiratory sensitizers, they generally can show long-term harm. It's the big difference why respiratory sensitizers are generally getting classified in physical products, but dermal ones are not, even though in physical products, dermal sensitizers kind of would, you think, to be a problem. What they're doing instead is they're often starting to regulate them under the term allergen. And most dermal sensitizers are also allergens. So we see a lot of ones that are on allergens. And often allergens can also move to a restriction. So these are the main classifications seen in products, dominated by the first one. The one that sees the most classification, the CMR ones. So ReACH SVHC has all of these, as does Prop 65 only has the carcinogens and reproductive toxins. Endocrine disruptors are not explicitly in unless they're reproductive toxins. However, Prop 65 is about 1,000 times stricter limit for reproductive toxicity than the general EU or international limits. So often endocrine disruptors end up being under Prop 65 anyways, like 2-MBT, tumor captive benzotriazole, very common vulcanization agent in rubber. It's a sulfur-based vulcanization agent. It's one of the thyroid disruptors. Anything that disrupts the thyroid can cause thyroid cancer, but it generally causes bladder cancer. There's an interrelation there. So because of the threshold differences for cancer, 2-MBT is regulated under Prop 65 and not yet regulated in the EU. It's on the path towards being regulated as an endocrine disruptor, thyroid disruptor, but it's not there yet. All of these are classification. The main difference between the US one and the EU ones is Prop 65 in California has a stricter limit for cancer and reproductive harm. So also, the classification generally are based on the EU classifications. They're generally the most modern and the most up-to-date, and most countries refer to them, not necessarily directly saying the classification in the EU is this, therefore it's here, they often classify it, and then the footnote is the EU classification. And you can see this when we do chemical labeling for products in Canada and the US. What you'll see in the Canadian or WMIS system is you'll see its categorization, category 1 or 2, skin sensitizer, whatever they want to call it, but the actual footnote reference is the EU classification system. So the EU classification system is probably the most dominant. The Prop 5 is stricter. However, the EU classification system also has information on probable and what are not harmonized classifications, but are generally used. And you'll see even more relationship with Prop 5. So the most common ones requiring classification are carcinogens, reproductive toxins, and allergens. The newer ones, the endocrine disruptors, which are very strong overlap with Cat1 reproductive toxins, and respiratory sensitizers. Now we're going to talk about the bioaccumulants is also the other really common classification, but they don't come from the classification legislation. They end up being expressed. So when you look at Techlorine Plus, which is a new REACH SVHC, and those, they are classified as a persistent organic pollutant, very persistent, very bioaccumulant, end up becoming REACH SVHCs, but they're actually, the classification doesn't often start here. It actually starts through a different process. So we'll talk about the UN resolutions, the fourth. Yes, persistent organic pollutant is also a classification. It just has a different source for the most part. These ones all basically come from the EU classification system. We can dicker about some of the international and US, but they really all come from the EU one. And so what you're looking at is substances that are Cat1 carcinogens or Cat1 reproductive toxins or endocrine disruptors are going to have some level of warning, whether now or later. One of the ones you're seeing right now, it's a big difference, is cobalt. Cobalt in the EU in February was reclassified as a Category 1 carcinogen, 1B, known to cause in animals, which for most products, it doesn't mean it's regulated yet. EU MDR means when it kicks in officially next October, it'll be regulated in EU MDR in the absence of anything else happening. Where the problem for that is cobalt is up to 0.2% in most high quality stainless steel. It doesn't have to be there, but it generally is between 0.1 and 0.2. That'll create EU MDR regulatory issues, mostly labeling and justification. But now it's Category 1, REACH SVHC. If somebody put it forward, has a pretty clear path towards regulating as an SVHC. So in 2021, it's not impossible. Cobalt is a REACH SVHC, and therefore SVHC declarations are required for most stainless steels and a variety of other materials. So that all follows the classification. Classification is a big deal. When a substance gets reclassified, things will happen. About 2 years ago, bisphenol A was reclassified as a Category 1 reproductive toxin, and then we started sales regulation around it. That reclassification first created the warning requirement and then further enabled the risk management measures, which we'll talk about. So classification is one of the most important first steps. Even on the RoHS side, it's harder to regulate a substance in RoHS if it's, well, first has to be there in electronics at some reasonable level to pose a hazard to the recycling worker, but it also has to usually be a recognized hazard. So classification does have a huge impact on all of them. Now, we also get supplier requests where one supplier is asking one of our customers, or one of our customers asking one of our customers, I need you to declare all Category 1 CMRs in your product. That's not trivial. And if it's not regulated that way, it's very difficult to manage. So EU MDR, medical device regulation, it's a little bit different because it is regulated that way. So asking for Category 1 CMRs is in line with the regulation. Asking it for general products is not very helpful. So there's a lot of commonality. What's the commonality? The classification legislations normally follow EU classification. Prop 65 is a bit stricter, but it basically uses a stricter classification that you see on the EU side anyways. Like DINP is a carcinogen in Prop 65, but it's not a Category 1 in Europe. But it does have recognized properties. The highest risk substance, of course, the Category 1 carcinogens and reproductive toxins. And the differences in the different legislations, Prop 65, REACH, SVHC, are all around what type of warning it is and the thresholds. It's not whether lead or DHP requires a warning label, just what it is and what the threshold is. So this is the classification type of legislation where it's like the chemical classification. So instead of putting a safety data sheet at the chemical bottle, it's a warning or label of some sort of communication or SCIP entry for the physical product. And these are the classification ones, and they come from basically chemical classification, and they've extended it to physical products or articles. The third one is the risk management family. And that's a little bit different, really common, and probably the hardest to understand. The idea is a country has identified that a substance is a priority for some level of risk management. There's some hazard they've identified, and they want to figure out what's the best way to manage the risk of this hazard, which could be restriction, it could be notification of use to the government, and there's a lot of ones like that. The Canadian Prohibition, the articles part of TSCA, not the chemical side, it's totally different, the REACH restrictions, they're around risk management. And so they're around risk management, risk mitigation. They will have a process to identify priority substances. So which substances are priority to look at, i.e. which ones should we spend the money on to look at whether risk mitigation management is required. A stepwise process to determine the best way to mitigate the real or perceived dangerous chemical. Should be perceived, not processed. My mistake. So examples to REACH restrictions. So how can REACH be a classification one and a risk mitigation? They're two different elements. When REACH was created, it absorbed in the Dangerous Substances Directive, which included historical restrictions. So absorb the restrictions process into it. So it's actually the same legislation as the SVHC, but a totally different section and managed differently. TSCA for articles, and we're talking about the priority substance process right now with a lot of people, and the Canadian Prohibition of certain toxic substances, really the SCIP process, but the actual restrictions, the Canadian Prohibition. We try to focus on the restriction end of it, but we'll explain the whole thing. And if you do our monthly or quarterly updates, we actually go through each one at some point in time in detail, how the US one works, how the Canadian one works, how the EU one works. They're very similar. They have different names, but they work very similar. Basically, the country, or the EU, identifies a substance requiring some assessment of risk. And we see these consultations through REACH restrictions all the time. We see in Canada all the time. It's a little harder to follow because they don't centralize things as well. And we see this right now going on for 20 substances under TSCA. So they identify a priority substance. They have different names for it. We'll say a priority substance, something they want to do work on to determine what they're going to do about it. Then they have a variety of consultations, first on its uses and volumes usually. Sometimes they might have enough internal data, which Europe, because of all the registration data, may have more data. But often they do some level of consultation where it's used and whether it even makes sense to be a priority substance. And you'll see this in Canada and the US in particular. Europe has a bigger database and doesn't necessarily do it as often because they already have a lot of the use and volume information. They don't have as much as they want, which is one of the reasons for the SCIP database. SCIP database will let them see per customs code what risk substance they're using, and they'll use that to determine which substance to prioritize to go through this process. That's a big part of what SCIP's for. As much as it's for identifying the waste providers, what is generally in the waste, so they can handle these hazards of dangerous chemicals. And there's a certain amount of it allow consumers and businesses to look at products and are better informed about the hazards of the product. One of the main reasons is to give them the ability to aggregate data at the customs code level to determine what substances and what product types are a priority to do this, the REACH restrictions, or in certain cases, the RoHS process. Some of the risk mitigation or management process in Europe can be, you know what, this is through CORAP. CORAP is amazing, Community Rolling Action Plan, CORAP. And they put the O in it so they could pretend it wasn't the word that they really thought it was. It's kind of funny. I love that acronym. It's the CORAP process, or the REACH restriction process farther down the line. Eventually, once they determine that it's used and it makes sense to look into it, they do a consultations on the proposed risk management. And you'll see this in REACH restrictions. They often have gone pretty far down the line, and they're doing some level of consultation on either a specific risk management strategy, like a ban or restriction, like on phthalates. They just went through on virtually all products. Or they could be much earlier, where they have some of them. It's not quite the same thing. They're doing a consultation on microplastics, partially to figure out whether they're used, but also get a better idea of what really makes sense as a risk management process. So they all have these. They basically, what are the substances we want to go after? What are the priorities? Consultation on uses or volumes, unless they already have the data. Then they do consultations on the risk management options, often drilling down to a restriction. And we're seeing this in Canada a lot right now. You're going to see probably some of the newest substance restrictions in the world coming out of Canada. And they're out of partially this risk management process, but the substances being chosen are coming out of the UN Stockholm Convention, which is the fourth thing we're going to talk about. And even though the risk management process and the classification process, like SVHC, do overlap very heavily with the UN conventions, the UN conventions pretty well end up identifying the substances that go into the classification processes, like REACH SVHC, or go in to the risk management processes like that. So we separated out the UN conventions because they basically are really the source for the bioaccumulants, persistent organic pollutants, and why they end up in these processes, to give a little predictability. So they do a consultation, and then they eventually implement some risk management measure, which could be as much in Canada, say for cobalt. Instead of banning cobalt, their version is to change the limit for cobalt in the water supply, as opposed to potentially being REACH SVHC in Europe. So the management measure can be quite different. Often there are restrictions. So the REACH restrictions, all the modern ones, are basically gone through this process. And if you trace it back, now that if you look up EU chemical information for any substance, you can see the progression. They actually have links to basically all these progressions for any given substance. So as the phthalates move forward for general restriction and general products, it has all the links to all these different steps it went through. So this is a risk management process, which way it affects our products, your products, is normally it ends up being a restriction of some sort. So commonality, it is less commonality than other requirements because it follows both technical and political priorities. They have to choose to push it forward and walk it through this process. In general, there are variations on the EU REACH restrictions. The EU REACH restrictions are generally ahead. They may not be the same thresholds, but when you look at the restrictions of PFOA coming to Canada, look at the EU one first. It's less predictable than other sources because it has a political element. They have to choose to put it forward and they have to walk it through this process. And what they choose to put forward can have some political impact. So it's less commonality. The EU REACH restrictions in general are the best starting point. If you're looking at a lot of the priority substances going through in the US, the ones that will affect products are already REACH restrictions to a certain extent. So, like the phthalates. So the fourth one are the UN conventions. And the UN conventions is really a classification process. We're going to talk mostly about one of them. It's basically a UN agreement to restrict or limit a family of chemicals. It's global agreement by all countries, but the implementation may be different. So for example, persistent organic pollutants, the US is one of the Stockholm Convention, the US is one of the biggest writers of the ban or restriction on short chain chlorinated paraffins. So they wrote it, they agreed upon it, but for a variety of reasons, it's hard to pass federal legislation in the US, so it's not implemented in the US. It's kind of an irony about the whole thing. So they wrote the restriction, or one of the writers of it, but couldn't implement it themselves. So the UN Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants is probably the one that's going to affect your products the most. The Montreal Protocol and related conventions beyond that affect fluorocarbons, ozone depleting materials, refrigerants. And we still deal with refrigerant problems people are having even now. But for the most part, we're going to talk about the persistent organic pollutant side, the UN Stockholm Convention. It's to a certain extent a classification, but it's really all the countries getting together, agreeing, and then the countries start implementing it in their own either classification system, like REACH SVHC, or risk management approach, like Canada. So, but it's really the source. Once they agree in common, the persistent organic pollutants, then we start seeing the regulation, either in labeling or restriction, at the country levels. And the UN Stockholm Convention is a big deal. So it's a global regulation of persistent organic pollutants. It's around bioaccumulants. These are substances that in general are not harmful on its own, but they bioaccumulate in the environment until they become harmful. So one of the more recent ones is the siloxanes. It's the building blocks of silicone rubber. It's also the main way people moisturize their skin. So if you use Head and Shoulders, for example, hair conditioner, they don't normally moisturize your hair anymore. They have certain elements of it. What they really do is they coat your hair or skin with silicone rubber under the name of dimethicone or cyclopentasiloxane. And that coating allows air through, but not water. So the way a lot of these are working now is you coat your skin or hair with silicone rubber. People say, well, some people say, I have a really expensive moisturizer. I can't have that. Oh, it has more. The more expensive the moisturizer, the more siloxanes it has. And they're harmless to you. It's one of the reasons we use silicone in kitchen utensils. It doesn't react with humans. That's one of the problems. It doesn't, the siloxanes, which are the building blocks, and silicone rubber doesn't cure perfectly, are normally residual, like D6, siloxane, in the actual silicone rubber, and they build up in the environment because the environment can't process them either. So these are all things that build up in the environment that are not necessarily hazardous off the bat. One of the other ones is DECA BDE. It's the only polybrominated diphenyl ether we ever see. And the other ones we see are just because they're contaminants or breakdown products of DECA. The reason DECA is restricted under RoHS is not because it is a hazard, because it's not directly. It's because it breaks down relatively easily into NONA and OCTA, which are hazards to recycling worker. DECA itself is fairly non-reactive, which is very common with most flame retardants. To be a good flame retardant, you want to A, be happy with plastics and oil, so they like fat, and B, they don't oxidize or burn, so they don't break down very well. So DECA is also persistent organic pollutants, as is dichlorine plus. And most of the substances that do that job, they're gas phase flame retardants. They release halogens into the air during a burning to damp down the burn, are mostly bioaccumulants, just because of the way they work. So the related regulations are persistent organic pollutant in Europe and the Canadian prohibition. The US doesn't specifically have its own version right now. Now, one of the reasons why this is a big deal in Canada is for a variety of reasons. In North America, it's very difficult to prove human harm. The threshold to prove human harm is very high. However, to prove bioaccumulation, especially if somebody signs on at the UN Convention, is much easier. So what we're seeing restricted in Canada for the most part right now, and most of the new restrictions you're going to see, like the chlorine plus, are because it's much easier to prove harm to the environment than it is to prove harm to humans. So because of it coming from a UN convention, there's a high commonality in substance. There's low commonality of application limits. They have different limits. But which substances are being regulated is very common. So short chain chlorinated paraffins, dichlorine plus. Now the difference is in the EU for this point in time, dichlorine plus is a REACH SVHC, not a POP restriction. Canada, it's on path with DBDPE to be banned sometime in 2023. The ban will probably come out in 2021. Why is this a big deal? Dichlorine plus is rarer, but we still see it because of REACH SVHC. DBDPE is not otherwise regulated. If you looked at it and DECA BDE, you kind of notice they're almost identical. It's a bioaccumulant. It's extremely common. It's the main replacement for DECA. DECA is very useful historically. It's a very good flame retardant in conjunction with antimony trioxide for thin plastics. So when we pick up antimony and bromine today, it's generally not DECA. It's most of the time this one. So when this gets regulated in Canada, say in 2023 as a restriction, it's going to have a lot of impact. But it all comes from the same source, the UN Stockholm Convention. So as we talked about, it's vastly oversimplified. Just give you a bit of history lesson to understand a bit where they're coming from: waste, classification and labeling, risk management, and UN Convention. There's a lot of overlap. A lot of them feed into classification. Classification feeds into a lot of them. But a lot of the legislations you have to comply to fit in one of these bins. Now, they're common approaches. There are significant overlaps in chemicals. We keep talking about phthalates. We keep talking about the chlorine plus, short chain chlorinated paraffins, lead. Sometimes their limits are different. Is there a useful subset? Yes and no. It's not perfect, but there is a lot of overlap. The key regulations are EU RoHS, REACH SVHC, REACH restriction, and Prop 65. With Canadian prohibition is going to bully its way in there in about 2023. It's going to have a couple restrictions nobody else has. They will be regulated, probably as REACH SVHCs, both in Europe, but they won't necessarily have restrictions yet. But up until now, that core group at the top represents most of everything. The difference is different jurisdictions will have different rules around them, but in general, that's the core set. We can talk about Australia asbestos, which is also a REACH restriction to a certain extent. The asbestos is less of a risk in most of your products. We do find it intermittently as the lubricant powder inside talc. Talc is basically asbestos with better marketing, mostly. It's the same material set, and often asbestos is co-mined with so talc is co-mined with asbestos, and most talc has tiny bits of asbestos in it. Otherwise, asbestos really isn't a big risk. So this is the main group. They cover virtually all the key substances, but there's often different limits or different warnings on different jurisdictions. But these are the key substances. If you have this data set, you're pretty far along. You can build most of your persistent organic pollutant stuff out of it. You can build your China RoHS, your Taiwan RoHS, your Korea RoHS out of this part. China REACH, Korea REACH don't have a product. They're only chemical based. It's a good starting point, but you really do need to stay abreast of the changes. The devil is in the details. But in terms of management of chemicals and substances in your products, this core group, if you can't do everything, you really want to do this core group. The Canadian prohibition will bully its way in, but a lot of the suppliers might not know it very well right now. And its overlap with POP is so strong right now that it's not the end of the world. But short chain chlorinated paraffins is the one extra. It is a REACH SVHC, but it's banned under POP and in Canadian prohibition. So that's the one extra substance. But basically those, making sure you handle SCCPs, is the best core set if you can't do all of them. And not everybody can do all of them off the bat. By the way, I'm getting to the end here. We have another webinar. We're doing one in April. We have a date probably next week. It's SCIP and your business. So we've talked a lot about creating the declarations. We're going to talk more about rolling it out corporately. It's a good question. So I can talk about the technical stuff. And we definitely recommend, for sure, everybody create a declaration. One of our best services is a web demonstration. We take one of your products, if it's small, and we dismantle it for you, do an ENG evaluation and show you what's going to be declarable, create a declaration for you, and then we now build the building blocks of it. So we create the component templates, which I'll explain in a second. But we're going to talk about rolling out corporately, how to cover all your products, how to manage business units, how to give them, more importantly, a target. As you might find this difficult all to take in, and you might not be doing all the work yourself, you might be, but what is the target you have for each product? So the business units or yourself can complete, saying, I have this building blocks, all I need for each product is to build this template. And how to manage other regulations in parallel. There's some commonality. So that's the one probably for next week. We normally only do a webinar once a month or every 2 months, but right now it's sort of a different situation. We try to give people the ability to learn, especially when they're working from home. Again, can't stress enough how good this service is. Love it. Once a quarter, a month, depending on your setup, we have a web meeting with you and we talk about what we're talking about today, but it's interactive. And we talk more specifically about the specific SVHCs, about the registration program, about the warning system Prop 65, about the enforcement of Prop 65, much more specific. So very good. Feel free to contact us. It's a very popular service. Almost everybody who's ever signed up for it is still with us for it. So again, we're looking at today is really 4 different groupings. It's an oversimplification, but at least gives you some background where it all comes from. Waste, which is mostly our RoHS side. Classification and labeling, which is basically labeling of hazards on articles, physical products, instead of just chemicals, but it's similar enough. Risk management, the substance identifies a priority and walks through a process and consultations to the point where it has some risk management, usually restriction that comes out of it. And then the UN Convention, where countries agree on a risk or hazard to a family of substances, with the countries agreeing to implement some level of management of that risk, which then flows back either into classification, labeling, or risk management. It just comes from a different source, so we list it differently. So again, next webinar, skipping your business. It's going to be very practical on how to roll it out. How to actually manage it. You're going to find most of the stakeholders here, a good portion of your work isn't just identifying the SVHCs, and it isn't just identifying, the declaration for that product. It's identifying all the products you have to do it for, figure out who's going to do the work, and give them a target to complete for that work. SCIP service, super popular. We're doing a lot of work on this right now. One, we can do testing, of course. You have a product. I would like to know the REACH SVHCs and have a SCIP declaration. Give it to us. It'll be part of the testing. It's really good for new products. If you're doing RoHS at the same time, it's the process we have. Yes, the chemicals are different, but the process we have has such overlap. Based on the flow chart we use, and we showed in our web demonstration, it's all the same flow chart. It just has some different decision points and some other chemicals we look at, but the flow is the same. So it's very efficient to do. If you're doing one regulation like Prop 65, do REACH at the same time. There's the flow. Yes, it costs more, but the flow is very similar and doesn't cost nearly as much to do separately. But the other one that's really popular, especially when you're getting started, is this engineer evaluation. Right now it's web. We used to do it on site, not as popular right now. But we do a lot of this. And where we sit down, we do a little more education on the rules, explain the process, because it's going to be important to again re-stamp or repeat the process we're using. We do an eng evaluation. We'll take your product apart. If it's small, physically, over the webcam, we'll show you. We have an incredible setup with multi-cameras, so we can show close-ups and far away. Or if it's a larger product, from cameras or pictures at your end, we create a declaration based on what materials, what SVHCs are likely there based on the materials. We then take whatever part data you have or BOM information, and there's different levels of it, we explained in our last webinar, and refine it. Then what we do, so we get a declaration for individual product, but what's more important, we're going to talk about that in the next webinar, is you're going to have a template for a finished product, and then we're going to create the component templates, and all the technical information for SCIP are in the components. So the leaded brass part, in the D6 in the silicone part, they have all the technical elements. So if we build those component templates, all you're doing at the product level is saying, my analyzer has 12 leaded brass components, 4 D6 and siloxane, 1 button cell battery, etc. And they're just saying how many of those you have, and that's all you have to do. Because the component templates, all the SVHC, the safe use instructions are already built. So it's just a matter of saying how many of each you have, which not only makes your life easier, if you have to roll it out to other stakeholders, you just basically say, here's the sheet you fill in. I just need the product name, its barcode number, or whatever you decide on, serial number. I need to know its customs code and how many of each of these you have. That's all. It's a lot easier. And then we do support, usually about 6 months, where it's on call. As you move forward, we keep in contact with you and help you through the process. So you don't know what you don't know. So we're there to help you. And everybody runs into similar problems and with a few unique ones. So it's really, really helpful. If you don't know what you want to do for SCIP, it's the best starter. We'll do one with you. Everybody would recommend doing one. It's a big deal. We're going to have a webinar next week. Is going to talk even more about this, but also the reason for this is also the way you're going to end up rolling it out. Whether you're going to do all the work or other people are going to do the work, you need a target. So how do you do that? How do you create the template that people are going to fill in that doesn't blow their mind? So we're going to create the technical side underneath it, and people are just checking off how many of each component they have. So it's a lot easier for you to review and double check because it's just how many of, as opposed to anything complicated. It's a single page or a couple fields, which is much easier to review. And then the way it's built in iEuclid, it's just once we build the iEuclid component templates, we give them to you, and you're just checking how many of each you have. It's really easy. It's drag drop. I'm going to walk you through that. So I think I get to questions, which I am. I went actually a little bit longer than I thought. But now if you have any questions, put it into the control panel. I have to shrink this to get the control panel, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. Some people had audio problems about 10 seconds. I apologize. It's a strange world right now we're living in. Everybody's overwhelming system. I'm on a fiber optic line today, which is usually better than normal. Okay, questions. Do the slides afterwards? Yes. So everybody who registered will receive a copy of the slides, and there will be a recording online. And one of the other things I forgot to announce is when we did the web demonstration a couple weeks ago, we weren't sure if we're going to put the recording up. It's kind of a different thing, but we did put the recording up. So our web demonstration of our testing is actually also on our website. You can also it's on YouTube, which means you can actually scroll it back to 70% speed, and I sound like a human being. It's a lot of fun. A lot of people here like it. Good point. So the book talks about for RoHS, they could not ban these substances at 100% since lead, mercury was natural occurring. So decided homogeneous materials to get as close to exposure for recycler workers' environment. So one of these comments, a really good comment, is they couldn't say no lead, no mercury, because they exist as impurities, and the coal-fired plants actually put a little bit of mercury everywhere. So they had to create a limit. 1,000 ppm was chosen for most substances because that's the normal, even chemical declarable limit of 0.1% on a safety data sheet. Cadmium is a bit stricter. It's always been a bit odd that way. That has a stricter limit, but the other ones all follow the declarable limit you have for safety data sheets. And you can't say it has none, because it's amazing what trace elements of anything. It could be in the air or otherwise. The following materials belong to RoHS or REACH or Prop 65. Radioactive materials, PCBs, beryllium, copper. Okay, so what the list we're looking at here, if you get an obscure list, and you're not sure what it is, send it to us and we can tell you what's going on. When you get a list like this particular one is the old Joint Industry Guide, a list from, geez, almost a decade ago, which we still see, often because people have bought a software package related to it. Radioactive material is governed under other legislations. Polychlorinated biphenyls are a REACH restriction. Beryllium copper is not restricted at this point in time. Beryllium oxides are category 1 carcinogens and some of the berylliums end up being regulated under MDR. Beryllium is one of the few materials that classify for regulation but isn't outside of MDR. So beryllium copper is an historical one. Halogenated materials is mostly an industry standard, except Sweden put in a flame retardant tax, which also differentiates between reacted flame retardants. So tetrabromobisphenol A, which is the building blocks of the brominated polycarbonate and FR4 circuit boards, the most common circuit board, uses tetrabromobisphenol A, but it's fully reacted in and only ends up the trace amount. So there's a big difference between reacted ones and additive ones like DECA-BDE. Which is doesn't react in and is added to the polymer. So halogenated is historical and it's also not very helpful. Carcinogenic substances, that's one we hate. Is there any CMR ones? Under what regulation? So big thing for us is we need a regulation or standard because it sets the rules, the thresholds, as the person before mentioned. You can't say cannot have none, any, because anything could have trace levels. How good is your test? So carcinogenic substances is, again, these are all these ones from a historical list. Chlorofluorocarbons is Montreal Protocol. It's usually ozone depleting legislations. You're really looking at refrigerants. Lithium and lithium compounds, very strange one because almost all batteries have it. That's not regulated. PVC we'll see in a lot of different things, usually in building rules in the US for LEED, which is not very helpful because PVC can mean anything. There's flexible PVC, there's rigid PVC. Can PVC be dangerous? Absolutely. But not because of the PVC, it's because of the additives, the plasticizers and the secondary plasticizers and the flame retardants and the colorants and the stabilizers. Those are what's dangerous. PVC itself is not dangerous. So there's tons of other ones. Generally, when you get a list like that, send it to us. Some of them actually come from historical lists that no longer used anymore. Does Prop 65 have limits? Yes and no. So our Prop 65, there are a number of substances that have safe harbor limits, usually for a particular exposure type. And as long as the exposure on a daily basis is below that, you're underneath the safe harbor limits. Some do not. And from that, we can calculate based on its cancer potency or no observable adverse effect limits, the de facto Prop 65 NRSL. But they're on exposure. They're around micrograms per day. Now, some of them have been prosecuted so many times, like lead or phthalates, that they have de facto concentration limits based on settlements. So there are settlement limits and there are exposure limits either specifically for a substance or calculatable. So you're running into a problem, just talk to us. We're pretty well the experts in Prop 65. Is there any public databases which summarize the main legislation, the substance limits, and common use of these substances or a subset thereof? Sort of. So on our website, it's not up yet. It should be momentary. We have a world map where you'll be able to click on every different country in the world and see its restricted materials legislation and a little blurb on it. So it's not perfect, but basically be a world map that on our website that you can just click on any country and see the limits. Not up yet, should be released momentarily. I missed the assessment broadcast. You decided whether or not you'll publish the video? Yes. So we're publishing all the ones, including the testing one. So the assessment one we did last week. It should be on our website as of 2 days ago. And the other one actually just went up yesterday. So the web demonstration, testing demonstration is also there. What does SCIP mean? Substance of concern in products or complex substance of concern in complex objects or products. It's really substance of concern in products. It's SCIP. They love acronyms. It's just CoRep, SCIP, REACH. REACH actually has a second R in it. There's an R between the E and the C, but it's silent. When you say there's a relatively large overlap for key regulations you had at the end, how do we know what's missing? Talk to us. We can explain the details. The devil's in the details. In general, those are the majors. The difference in normally the others is limits, thresholds, and how they're expressed. The wordings are different. So those ones usually dictate all the substances. The other ones may have different ways to express its concentration. Am I on the right webinar? Where do restricted materials legislations come from? Yes. I got a funny feeling I went for a wander at times. There's a lot of history in here. Hopefully this is all helpful. Thanks again for all the questions. I went way over time. A lot of people stayed right to the end. Very appreciated. So everybody who registered will receive a copy of the slides. Within a couple of days, we should have a recording available online. And if you have any questions, just contact us. And if you have any suggestions for another webinar, feel free to send it along. There's no harm in it. It doesn't cost you a thing. Thanks much to everyone, and talk to everyone again soon.